On August 1st, a satellite passed over Kharg Island in the northern Persian Gulf and took pictures that told a more complete story than any press release from Washington or Tehran. 3 berths, all empty. The western terminal had been vacant for 14 days. The liquefied petroleum gas terminal for 5 days. The eastern terminal had briefly hosted a tanker that had since departed without loading. 19 tankers were sitting in the waiting area nearby, their automatic identification system transponders switched off, clustered in the kind of holding pattern that Shadow Fleet vessels adopt when they want to stay close to the loading facility without being tracked by the Western maritime intelligence services that publish their positions. The waiting area had held 17 such vessels 2 days earlier. The number was growing. The berths remained empty. Kharg Island, the 8-square-mile coral platform that handles approximately 90% of Iran's crude oil exports, had, as of July 31st, stopped loading tankers entirely for the second time in 3 months. The Financial Times confirmed it on Friday, August 8th, citing data from KPLR and Energy Aspects, 2 of the energy market's most reliable cargo tracking providers. The maritime intelligence company Windward said all 3 berths on the island had been empty for an extended period. Iran's oil lifeline has been cut, not with bombs, not by destroying the infrastructure that took decades to build, but by a naval blockade that has simply made it impossible for tankers to reach the terminal and leave with what they came to collect. Understanding why the berths are empty and why that emptiness is different from anything previous American administrations achieved with sanctions requires understanding the specific mechanics of what the reimposed U.S. naval blockade has accomplished since it snapped back into place around July 7th. The physical infrastructure on Kharg Island is largely intact. The oil wells feeding the terminal through pipeline from onshore and offshore fields are still operating, though at reduced rates that Iranian officials themselves have begun acknowledging. The storage tanks are filling. The loading arms that attach to tankers and pump crude into their holds are functional. The island has not been bombed into rubble. What it cannot do is move the oil it contains, because the ships that would move it cannot get to it without running into a U.S. Navy that has made clear it will fire Hellfire missiles into smokestack of tankers. It determines are violating the blockade, as it demonstrated with the Belma on July 15th. The 19 tankers waiting in the holding area outside Kharg, transponders off, accumulating in greater numbers each day, are the physical manifestation of what happens when the world's most sophisticated naval force imposes a blockade, not by mining the waters around a port or blocking the channel with ships, but by making the calculation of consequences clear enough that the people operating the Shadow Fleet tankers that moved Iranian crude through years of sanctions pressure have decided, for now, that the risk of approaching the berths is too high. The timeline of how Kharg Island arrived at this moment runs through 3 distinct phases. The first blockade began on April 13th, roughly 6 weeks after Operation Epic Fury started, after the failure of the Islamabad pre-talks to produce a ceasefire framework that both sides' military institutions would honor. Between April 13th and mid-June, Iranian crude and condensate exports collapsed from nearly 2 million barrels per day to below 300,000 barrels per day, according to KPLR data. At some points during that first blockade phase, tracking services indicated Iranian crude exports had reached effectively zero. The pressure produced one visible economic consequence immediately. Iran began proactively cutting oil production at the wellhead, not waiting for storage to fill and force a shutdown, but deliberately reducing output to preserve the oil in the ground, rather than letting it accumulate in tanks that had nowhere to go. Fortune reported in early May, citing a senior Iranian official who asked not to be identified, that engineers were idling wells without lasting damage and who were confident they could restart them quickly, drawing on expertise accumulated through decades of sanctions-era cycles of disruption. Hamid Hosseini, a spokesman for the Iranian Oil, Gas, and Petrochemical Products Exporters Association, said at the time, "We have enough expertise and experience." That claim may be true. It is also the institutional statement of a sector trying to project resilience while facing pressure it has not encountered in exactly this form before. Because previous sanctions, however severe, left the physical act of loading tankers legally and practically available to countries that chose to buy Iranian crude, regardless of American financial restrictions. The naval blockade does not. The brief reprieve between mid-June and early July was the only interruption in that pressure, and it was produced by the Islamabad MOU, the 14-point framework that briefly made it appear the war might end before it consumed more of the American precision munitions stockpile and more of Iran's oil revenue simultaneously. During those roughly 3 weeks, Iran shipped between 40 and 70 million barrels of crude, mostly to Asian buyers who had been waiting for exactly this window, according to cargo tracking data. Parliament Speaker Ghalibaf, who had been Iran's chief negotiator, acknowledged the economic impacts of the blockade, but tried to reframe the export resumption as evidence of higher realized prices, arguing that the scarcity created by the blockade had driven up the per-barrel value of what did get out. That argument has a grain of truth in it. Brent crude above $90 benefits Iran's per-barrel revenue even if the volume exported is a fraction of normal. But it understates the cumulative cash flow damage of months at reduced or zero export volume, damage that U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent quantified this week in a post on X. Bessent wrote that Kharg Island was soon nearing capacity, and that this reality would cost Iran approximately $170 million per day in lost revenue, and would force Tehran toward negotiations. CENTCOM's own estimate of the blockade's cost has been higher, at $500 million per day across all Iranian oil and trade flows. Even taking the more conservative Bessent figure, $170 million per day across the weeks since July 31st, is a number that, compounding daily, makes the economic conversation inside Tehran increasingly urgent. Iran has been responding to the filling storage with the same technique it used during the first blockade phase, cutting production. Bloomberg, citing analysts at Kairos, reported that the slowdown in production was now visible in the satellite and sensor data. Antoine Half, co-founder and chief analyst at Kairos, said on a conference call, "It looks like there's been a significant slowdown in production." Aging, and in some cases derelict tankers have gathered near Kharg for floating storage, Bloomberg reported, a technique Iran has used during previous sanctions pressure to keep crude off balance sheets while finding buyers. The 19 waiting tankers visible in the August 1st satellite imagery that Windward analyzed include some of those floating storage vessels, sitting in the holding area with their transponders off, their crews waiting for either a window in the blockade or an order to leave. By Tuesday, August 5th, Windward reported the waiting fleet had dropped to only 16 vessels, the lowest number since the beginning of July. Energy Aspects said operations at Kharg had halted entirely on July 31st. The Jerusalem Post summary of the Financial Times report noted that the halt had not yet led to a significant filling of the island's oil storage tanks, which could indicate that Iran had already begun reducing production at its fields to avoid reaching the point where it has no storage space left. The dynamic that produces the soon nearing capacity warning Bessent issued is a slow-motion squeeze. Iran is producing less oil than normal to avoid tank tops. The oil it is producing is going into storage rather than onto tankers. The storage that already exists on land and in the floating fleet near the island is accumulating rather than turning over. There is a ceiling to how long this can continue before something has to give. Either Iran shuts in production entirely to avoid an embarrassing public tank top situation, or Iran finds a way to move oil that bypasses the blockade, or Iran negotiates a deal that lifts the blockade in exchange for concessions on the Strait, and potentially on the nuclear program. The first option damages Iran's oil sector infrastructure in ways that take time and money to reverse. The second option has been tried throughout this conflict, through the shadow fleet, through transponder off-runs, through every available workaround, and the results have been intermittent at best and have cost Iran ships disabled by Hellfire missiles at worst. The third option is what the Oman-Iran talks, which Reuters reported on Friday, are progressing toward a deal expected soon, are designed to produce. The Reuters report on August 8th, citing a U.S. official familiar with the negotiations, said there had been progress between Oman and Iran over the Strait of Hormuz, and that a deal was expected soon. The official added that the U.S. would lift its blockade of Iranian ports once an agreement was announced to restore commercial shipping through the strait without impediments. Bessent separately told reporters this week that a 30 to 60-day ceasefire agreement with Iran could come shortly. Iran International reported that the new U.S. sanctions announced alongside the diplomatic activity were intended to cut the financial lifelines that sustain Iran's ruling elite. With Washington continuing to target banks, exchange houses, and other facilitators it says Iran uses to move funds and evade sanctions. The pressure track and the diplomatic track are running simultaneously, which has been the pattern throughout this entire conflict. Maximum economic pressure applied in direct proportion to the pace of negotiations, with each side calculating whether the other's pain threshold is lower than its own. The seized Kharg Island option, which has been on the table explicitly since Trump's June 11th Truth Social post, and more explicitly since his NATO summit statement in Ankara, has been the subject of a sustained strategic debate inside Washington that Fox News, the Wall Street Journal, and the Council on Foreign Relations have all documented in unusual analytical detail. Retired four-star Army General Jack Keane, speaking on Fox's Sunday Morning Futures in March, was the most direct public articulation of the administration-adjacent view. We can take Kharg Island at a time of our choosing, and we choose not to take that now. He continued, would we take it in the future? Those options are there for the president, likely towards the end of this, because if we take Kharg Island, either we occupy it or blockade it, there's a number of things that we can do. The phrase at a time of our choosing is the military professional's way of saying the decision has been made not to act yet while preserving the credibility of the threat. The phrase likely towards the end of this suggests Keane sees a Kharg seizure or intensified blockade as a closing move rather than a mid-game option. Fox News Digital's March 27th analysis by Morgan Phillips laid out the debate with unusual specificity. Options under discussion, the analysis said, range from interdicting tankers at sea to striking export infrastructure from the air. Approaches, some argue, could pressure Tehran's finances without putting troops on the ground. R.P. Newman, a Marine veteran and counterterrorism analyst, told Fox there is a big debate going on right now about whether seizing Kharg would actually disrupt Iran's oil revenue or leave key export flows intact, while exposing American forces to sustained attack. The concern Newman and other analysts raise is that physical occupation of Kharg Island would put American troops 21 miles from Iran's coastline, within range of every ballistic missile, cruise missile, armed drone, and anti-ship system that the IRGC has been stockpiling and partially rebuilding throughout the conflict. The July 13th strikes on Bushehr, Chabahar, Jask, Konarak, Abu Musa, and Bandar Abbas were designed to degrade precisely those coastal strike capabilities. Whether 5 months of American strikes have degraded them enough to make a Kharg occupation tactically viable is the classified assessment that determines when and whether, at a time of our choosing, becomes now. The naval blockade's current effectiveness, producing empty berths and a growing backlog of waiting tankers without requiring ground troops or the destruction of oil infrastructure, has actually reduced the immediate pressure to escalate to seizure. If the blockade is costing Iran $170 to $500 million per day with no American boots on the island, the additional benefit of physical occupation has to be weighed against the very substantial additional risk it creates. A blockade can be lifted diplomatically when a deal is struck. A military occupation creates facts on the ground that are significantly harder to walk back, without either a victory declaration that Iran can live with politically or a humiliating American withdrawal. Keynes, likely towards the end of this framing, suggests the prevailing view among the administration's military advisors is that occupation is a closing move, available when diplomatic resolution on American terms is either imminent or has failed permanently, not a mid-game escalation to deploy, while negotiations through Oman are still producing progress reports described as promising by Reuters. There is one dimension of the Kharg situation that Iran International flagged in the days after the Financial Times report on the empty berths, and that goes beyond the immediate military and diplomatic calculus. Former U.S. Treasury official and sanctions strategist Miad Maleki told I for Iran that the greater danger to the Iranian regime may actually emerge, not during the war, but after it ends. If the conflict ends today, then you're going to see the economic effect of the war doing its work. That would be very scary if I was an Iranian regime official, having to face the reality of a post-war economy. His argument is that the war, while economically devastating, has also functioned as a mobilizing force that allows the regime to demand sacrifice, suppress dissent as wartime disloyalty, and frame all economic hardship as the result of foreign aggression rather than domestic mismanagement. A post-war Iran that still has soaring inflation, reconstruction costs for the infrastructure. American and Israeli strikes have damaged years of cumulative economic decline from sanctions and blockade, and a population that survived the war but must now demand accountability for the conditions it left behind is, in Maleki's assessment, a more genuinely existential challenge for the Islamic Republic than the war itself. Ending the war lifts the naval blockade and restores oil revenue. It also exposes the full accumulated cost of everything the war consumed in the light of peace to a population that has been promised victory. Kharg Island's berths have been empty since July 31st. 19 tankers were waiting near the island on August 1st. The number dropped to 16 by August 5th, as some of them gave up or found other instructions. The western terminal has sat vacant for more than 2 weeks. The oil that should be flowing from Iran's wells through those terminals into supertankers heading for Chinese refineries is instead accumulating in storage tanks on the island and in the holes of derelict tankers anchored nearby, or is being held in the ground by engineers who know how to idle wells without lasting damage, drawing on 4 decades of sanctions-era expertise. U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent says the island is nearing capacity. Reuters says a deal could come soon. Bessent says a 30 to 60-day ceasefire could come shortly. Trump has said Iran would take Kharg Island next if talks fail. Retired General Keane says the U.S. can take Kharg at a time of its choosing. The physical infrastructure on the island is intact. The oil is not moving. The tankers are waiting. The blockade is working, without a shot fired at the island's oil infrastructure and without an American soldier on its coral ground. Whether what comes next is a deal that opens the berths again, a seizure that converts them to American-administered terminals, or an airstrike that converts them to rubble, is the question the 19 waiting tankers with their transponders off are sitting in the Persian Gulf asking, with no answer yet from either shore. The history of Kharg Island under attack is relevant here, because it is a history of survival that the current situation is deliberately designed to render irrelevant. During the 1980-1988 Iran-Iraq War, Saddam Hussein's Air Force conducted dozens of raids on Kharg Island as part of what became known as the Tanker War, an Iraqi strategy of striking Iranian oil export infrastructure to deprive Tehran of the revenue funding its war effort. The strikes hit oil tankers, damaged loading facilities, caused fires visible from miles away, and killed workers. They did not shut the island down. Iran repaired the damage, rerouted pipelines, built new loading infrastructure on smaller offshore facilities, and kept exporting through the worst years of the war. Western analysts of that period noted that Kharg Island proved far more resilient than anyone anticipated, absorbing strikes that would have been considered fatal to a comparable facility in any Western context, and returning to operations within days or weeks of each attack. The 2026 approach is specifically designed to exploit the gap between that history of physical resilience and a vulnerability the Iranians cannot solve by repairing damaged infrastructure. A naval blockade does not create damage to repair. It creates an absence of revenue that accumulates with each passing day the berths sit empty. Iran's oil sector engineers, who proved during the 1980s that they could keep loading crude through fires and bomb craters, have no engineering solution for a U.S. Navy that fires Hellfire missiles at tankers approaching the facility. The expertise Hamid Hosseini cited, Iran's decades of experience managing disruptions and cycling production through sanctions-era shutdowns, is genuinely relevant to the question of how long Iran can idle wells and manage storage without causing permanent damage to its production capacity. It is not relevant to the question of how long Iran can continue not selling oil before the revenue shortfall becomes a governance crisis. Those are different questions, and it is the second one that the empty berths at Kharg Island are forcing Iran to answer right now, in real time, while Reuters reports that a deal could come soon, and Bessent says a ceasefire could come shortly and the tankers wait in the holding area with their transponders off. The broader oil market impact of Kharg Island going dark for the second time in 3 months is visible in the price data, though the relationship is no longer as simple as it was in the early weeks of the conflict. Brent crude peaked above $100 on July 23rd during the escalation cycle and has been trading in the mid to high 80s since the ceasefire pause Trump announced on July 27th briefly restored some optimism. The current Kharg standstill has not produced a return to triple digits because markets have developed a more sophisticated understanding of the conflict's phases than they had in February and March. Traders now price in the expectation that escalation cycles eventually produce either a temporary deal that partially reopens shipping or a military response that degrades Iranian capability without collapsing the export infrastructure entirely. The scenario that markets are still pricing as a tail risk, the destruction of Kharg Island's oil terminal infrastructure or its physical seizure by American forces, would produce a price spike for which no recent precedent exists. It would also produce a supply disruption on top of a supply disruption, with the underlying Hormuz closure compounding with the specific elimination of the terminal that handles 90% of Iranian export volume. Rystad Energy has warned about exactly this risk, describing it as capable of producing a significant rebound in oil prices from whatever baseline the current situation has established. The new U.S. sanctions targeting Iranian financial infrastructure, announced concurrent with the Oman-Iran talks, reflect the layered strategy the administration has been deploying throughout. Military pressure through strikes and the blockade, economic pressure through the oil revenue cutoff at Kharg, and financial pressure through sanctions on the banking and exchange house network that allows the regime to move whatever money it does receive. Iran International described the new designations as intended to cut the financial lifelines that sustain Iran's ruling elite, which is a specific phrase, not to cut Iran's economy broadly, but to target the specific channels through which the IRGC, the Quds Force, the missile program, and the proxy networks get funded from oil revenue that has already been reduced by the blockade. The three-layer strategy, military plus blockade plus financial sanctions, is designed to ensure that even the oil Iran is managing to sell through whatever workarounds remain, through the 16 waiting tankers that might eventually slip out with transponders off, through whatever Chinese buyers are finding creative ways to pay for, reaches the institutional structures that matter as little as possible. Squeezing the IRGC's funding, while the IRGC is simultaneously having its physical maritime capability degraded by American strikes and its ability to move oil to market restricted by the naval blockade, is the administrative equivalent of cutting the fuel line to an engine you are also disassembling. Whether it is enough to produce a genuine negotiated settlement, rather than another temporary ceasefire that eventually collapses back into the tanker attack and U.S. response cycle, is the question the Oman talks are supposed to answer. The deal structure that a person briefed on the situation described to the Financial Times is specific. If Iran and Oman reach an agreement acceptable to both parties, the United States will lift the blockade and reinstate the oil sanctions waiver, allowing buyers to freely purchase Iranian crude. That would reopen the Kharg berths, restart the waiting tankers' loading operations, and flow oil revenue back to Tehran in the volumes it needs to begin managing the post-war economy that Miad Maleki described as potentially more dangerous to the regime than the war itself. The price of that opening, from Washington's perspective, is a restoration of commercial shipping through Hormuz without impediments, without the PGSA toll system, without the permit requirement, without the attacks on vessels that attempt to transit without paying. That is what the Islamabad MOU required too, and the IRGC demonstrated by attacking 3 tankers during the funeral of the supreme leader, while the MOU was still nominally in force, that the civilian government's signature on a transit agreement does not bind the institution that controls the waterway. Whether the Oman-Iran talks produce something that the IRGC will actually honor, rather than something that the civilian government will sign and the IRGC will attack its way out of, is the question that every previous ceasefire attempt in this conflict has been unable to answer satisfactorily. The berths at Kharg Island are empty, the tankers are waiting, the talks are progressing. The military options for what comes if the talks fail are on the table, and the man who built Kharg's most serious option into the public record said the U.S. can take it at a time of its choosing. The choosing has not yet been done. The timeline is being determined in part by the rate at which the storage tanks on the island fill up, and by whether the people negotiating in Oman can agree on terms before the economic pressure produces a crisis that removes the choice from anyone's hands.